Well, good evening, listeners. Thank you for listening to Lament of Hope podcast, and I'm your host, Danielle Richardson. And I am very excited today. It's kind of cool how this interview came about, but I'm speaking with Brian Reisinger, and he is the author of Land Rich Cash. Um, and the subtitle is My Family's Hope and the Untold History of the Disappearing American Farmer. And forgive me, it's land rich, cash poor. I don't want to forget that last word. But Brian, actually, I came across his work kind of by accident. I was speaking to his publicist, and she said, You'd really be interested in this book. And I took a look at it, and it's just such an interesting novel subject. It's about farmers. I mean, Brian grew up on a family farm, but it also talks about mental health for farmers, which I find very interesting. Also, talking about how farming in general is losing a lot of its traction and people, it's not as important, and that's actually detrimental for society as opposed to something that's good. So I wanted to just have him on the podcast to talk with him. He also has written several pieces and then has appeared in a lot of different magazines. I have here he's actually a rural columnist for the Milwaukee Journal Centennial US Today Network, and he's also written for a lot of other things. He was a journalist too, which is neat to meet as well. So, Brian, before we start, I just want to say, thanks for doing this and for putting this interview together last minute as well.
Oh, of course. Thank you for having me, Daniel. I appreciate it. And I think it's so great that you're raising awareness about these issues and get the chance to talk about it.
Well, I thank you, but I want to dive right in. When you mentioned the mental health aspect, I saw that in the book, and um, I mean, to be honest, I've never heard anything about mental health issues with farmers. That was the
Mhm.
first time that it ever come up. Never read an article on it, never heard a podcast about it. I mean, maybe it's because I don't have enough sources I'm looking at, but for you, why is the mental health aspect of farmers, first of all, important, and why does it matter for farming in general?
Yeah, it's so interesting what you say about how kind of unknown it is, because I think you're right. I think a lot of people don't realize. I mean, the crisis of our disappearing American farmer is an economic crisis. It affects our food prices and our food supply. It's a cultural crisis in so many ways. It also really feeds our mental health crisis. I think in this country, there are so many people, everyone has either experienced or knows someone who has experienced at this point some sort of mental health issue. It's a really big thing all across the country for people of all walks of life.
Yeah.
In farming, it is such a big issue and it is such an untold story because farmers are raised to keep your head down and get the work done. I remember walking the fields, picking rock by hand for my dad. And we got the chance to earn a little bit of money and learn how to work hard and all that stuff. But you also, boy, when you're raised to pick rock by hand, you're kind of raised to keep your head down and get the work done and not complain. And that is something that goes back through generations. My dad and his dad and on back through, it really is a community that doesn't talk about its mental anguish because you're supposed to be there to get the work done and to keep going and to face all of these difficulties that make it so hard for farms to make it increasingly decade upon decade. So
Hmm.
we just don't talk about it. And it became personally very important for me as we were going through some changes with our farm. The opening pages of Land Rich Cash Poor actually start with my dad in chapter one, and he and I are on the porch of a cabin we have in the woods out back of the farmhouse the day after we sold our herd of dairy cows. And for anybody who's been through that or knows a little about it, it's like the death in the family. We had milked cows for more than a century, and we were still moving forward farming. We were moving to diversified farming where we raise milk cows for other dairy herds, where we raise beef for consumers and we raise cash crops. So we were diversifying and changing our business model, but we were selling our cows because we weren't a big enough herd to make it anymore.
Hmm.
And it was the first time in a century that our family was fully walking away from that. And so it was really affecting my dad. And I remember standing on that cabin porch with him the day after we sold the cows, thinking about the issue of farmer suicide, worrying, wondering if he was having those dark thoughts as we were sharing some difficult moments together. And throughout the course of interviewing him for the book, he revealed to me that he had been thinking about harming himself, that he'd been feeling himself sinking into a depression. And I'm so grateful to say that he came out of that and he did that by thinking about my sister's kids, his grandchildren. And I'm so
Right.
grateful he did. but we had a brush with a kind of darkness that most families don't ever want to fathom. And I think it's so important to talk about that issue so that people know they aren't alone. And that's why my dad decided to share it too. He said, I really talked to him about, do we want to share this? And he said, I want people to know because I want them to know they're not alone and they don't have to be. So,
And you said that it was specifically triggering for your dad because of losing this aspect of farming that he'd been doing for a long time.
yeah.
Did did your dad struggle with mental health before that at all, or this was like the moment that kind of triggered it for him?
He had experienced it once earlier when I was a teenager. We had briefly sold the cows at that time too. And he ended up buying the cows back, and it ended up being sort of a temporary thing. But he felt himself sort of sink into a dark place at that time too. When we sold the cows more recently in spring of 2021, we knew it was final. And he and my sister were moving into a new phase of the farm. So my dad still owns it. My sister's taking it over. I'm so grateful she is. And they were working toward a new phase and there was some excitement to it, but he also knew that he was really closing that chapter. And
Okay.
to explain why it's like a death in the family, when you have a farm and you are fighting for that farm's for survival each day, you're not just fighting for your job, you're fighting for your home. It's where you live. You're fighting for your community. It's your people that you know. You're fighting for your heritage going back multiple generations. And our family had always milked cows for more than 100 years, and my dad was a third generation of that. So even though we were carrying the farm forward and we had what we hoped was a bright future, he was leaving something behind and he felt like he was letting everyone down. And as farming has gotten harder and harder, it's true of dairy farming, it's true of all kinds of other types of farming. As it's gotten harder and harder, so many farmers are left with that choice of feeling like they're letting their family down
Hmm.
if they, and that's the way that he felt.
Now, what would you say though for some people who might just say, well, mental health is an academic in general, I mean, epidemic in general, like you mentioned earlier, and everyone's struggling with it. What's so unique about farmers struggling with it?
Yeah.
Um, But I know you, when I was looking at also the bio for the book, I mean, I was talking about you've done a lot of interviews. It wasn't just your dad that you were getting all this information from. So why is it unique to farmers? I mean, why isn't it just different than people in general and young people struggling and um yeah, I mean, why is it
Yeah.
different?
It's a great question. What I would say is I think everybody's mental health challenges are valid. Some people are in crisis nearing suicide or other forms of harm. Maybe they're, struggling with addiction. We see that a lot in rural America as well. I myself have struggled with drinking problem earlier in my life. And so people have different levels of mental distress. And what I always say is that anybody who's in crisis, that's valid and they need to be treated with respect and someone who can work to bring them back into the light. But even people who are not dealing with that crisis level of something, talking to someone, whether it is a friend or whether it's a professional, can help those everyday things that we all deal with. It can help prevent those things from becoming a crisis. And so I think it's so important that everybody's mental health challenges, whether they are crisis level, whether they're every day, the kinds of things we all deal with, I think those are all valid. The
Right.
reason that it's such an important issue with farming is consistently ranked as one of the top industries in the country for suicide rates. It's farming,
Wow.
yeah, it's construction, logging, different types of really tough labor can sometimes be dangerous and also can sometimes be in economically distressed industries depending upon how the economy is doing. And so farming is just very consistently ranked up there. And, farmers face this situation where more and more farmers are having a hard time making it. So you can either hold on and keep trying to farm and risk failing to provide for your family, or you can sell the farm and lose everything else. Because again, the farm is your home and your heritage and your community, right? And
Hmm.
so farmers just face this such difficult choice of letting their families down by holding on and failing to provide, or selling the farm and providing for their family, but losing all of this meaning. And so it's just a really difficult choice for farmers. And so I think the thing that stands out about it is it reflects maybe some of the hardest kinds of elements of things that we all deal with. Everybody deals with dilemmas like that, and farmers are living it in a really extreme way that maybe if we talk more about it, we can not only help the farmers, but we can all understand our own mental health challenges a little bit better by looking at a really difficult example.
Now, how many farmers, like, are there stats for how many farmers a year take their lives or
Yeah, there are. I'd have to look at the exact statistics, but the last time I looked, I know that farmers were in the top five industries consistently across the country. And I'd have to look and see where it ranked overall. I think I actually have that information, and I might be able to pull it up and share it in the podcast here. But it's quite high, and it's consistently among the top in the country.
Now, do farmers have now is mental health resources like a thing with talking with farmers? Because I know with certain regions of America, but I mean, it's not America, but in other countries where even I've spoken about and talked to people about mental health, they had no idea what I was talking about. Like you could say, I'm having a hard time, but they didn't use labels like depressed, anxious. It was just like, yeah, this is life. So we don't really do anything about it. For farmers, is there an awareness of this, or is it kind of like it's just part of being a farmer kind of thing?
Yep, absolutely. It's a great question. And farmers, I would say it is a big part of farming because of the difficulty of the work. And it is so often an unacknowledged issue because, again, you're just taught to keep your head down and get the work done. And so I would say that it is sort of a sleeper issue. It's beneath the surface, and it's one that we're really working hard to make sure farmers themselves are even acknowledging. One of the big problems, because it is such an insular community where you're just there to get the work done and people don't talk about it, is that stigma. And I know people in all walks of life in all parts of the country experience some level of that stigma. It happens to be really intense as it pertains to farmers.
Hmm.
And so one of the things we need more of is there's a great organization called the Farmer Angel Network. They actually started in my home county in Sauk County, Wisconsin, because of another farmer down the road from us who had tragically taken his own life. And they work on what's called peer-to-peer support, where you have a network of farmers reaching out to other farmers, because that's one way to break in. And it's a lesson for everybody in all walks of life that struggle with mental health. Sometimes a peer can really be helpful because you might not talk to a therapist right away, but even if people would hope that you would, but you might listen to a farmer who calls you up and says, hey, I've been struggling with this myself. And so peer-to-peer support is really big. Another thing that needs to happen is we need to have more therapists in general in this country. It is a very difficult thing to get licensed therapists to the level that we need. It's something that's really in demand. And in rural America in particular, we need therapists who understand the dilemmas that rural Americans face. So with farmers, for instance, oftentimes therapists will correctly say, hey, you're so stressed out, you're having such a hard time, you need more work-life balance. Well, when a farmer is trying to work sun up and sun down because the cows need to be milked twice a day,
Yeah.
and they harvesting crops, and that can mean working all through the night to get the crops harvested before the rain comes. Advising work-life balance in that scenario doesn't exactly work. It doesn't mean that farmers can't find more balance in their lives, but it's just you need to have professionals in the mental health space who understand the real life dilemmas that farmers run into. So more peer-to-peer support, more therapists in general, and more therapists who are trained to understand the dilemmas in rural America.
But I also would think you don't have a lot of therapists in rural America in general, because I mean, I know like even my husband and I have been traveling whenever we visited more of a rural area. I mean, they don't even have gyms, like things like you would take for granted in the city here,
Yeah.
close to a lot of stuff going on. But I don't even think, I mean, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't seem like there's even much of a mental health presence in rural America.
Yeah, it's a real shortage. I think we need therapists more in this country in general, but there's a real shortage in rural America. That's absolutely true. It's just not something that is as readily available.
Hmm. And I'm interested because you're an advocate for this and a writer and also seeing everything that your parents have gone through and other farmers. I mean, has it ever kind of inspired you to think about doing some counseling, or it's just not something you think you could do?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. I myself have gone through and still do go through counseling. I haven't had anything as serious as my dad when he was in his depression and contemplating harming himself. But for many years, I dealt with a drinking problem for about a decade. From my well, let me think here, really early 20s into early 30s. And, I grew up in Wisconsin. I'm proud to have grown up in Wisconsin. There's a big drinking culture here. Also, farmers are among the many industries that tend to kind of work hard and play hard. And, so that can be a common thing. But for me, I mentioned that my sister is taking over the farm and my dad and her are farming together. I still help on the business side and they throw me in a tractor on my days off, but I went and pursued a career off the farm in writing, in journalism and then in public policy. And I was really rewarded to do that. And my dad was supportive of that, but I also always felt as the eldest son that I'd let him down. I was the first son in our family to go to college. I was also the first eldest son in four generations to not carry on the farm
Hmm.
and it wasn't my gift. I struggled with it. Um, and I came back around and got more involved. And now I'm so glad to be able to tell our story. But for many years, I felt like I let my dad down. And that wasn't the only thing that contributed toward my drinking, but it was one of them. And I found that in order to be able to ease off of my drinking and to be able to get that under control, one big keystone to that was being willing to talk to a therapist and address the underlying issues, and I'm grateful to say that I can't say that I have had an addiction issue like others have struggled with. I am still able to now and then have a drink in moderation. I was able to ease back from it before it really ruined my life, but I had to address those underlying mental health issues to be able to do that. So
Hmm. And farming in general, if we are, if farmers are really struggling mentally, how is that going to be impacting farming in general? And right now, even with the economy we're in, political or not, however you think about it, what do farmers need to
yeah.
thrive, to be able to be successful in what they do?
Well, that fits with the statistics about suicide that you'd asked before, and I knew I had them at my fingertips, so I'll just quote them real quick. So, in general, the working population, overall suicide rates in general are 32 people per 100,000 among males. And so that's 32 out of every 100,000 people who have committed suicide. And in farming, it's uh, quite a bit higher than that. In agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting, it's 47.9 people per 100,000. So it's much higher. And that's one of those numbers that drives farming into, one of the upper echelons as far as suicide rates. And that fits really well with your question about what do farmers need. The reality is that our farms are facing an economic crisis that has been going on for more than a century. For the last 100 years, we have lost an average of 45,000 farms per year on average getting wiped out by economic depression and recession, by changes in the industry, by political and governmental policies, by changes in technology. Some of these forces have brought good with them as well. Some
Hmm.
of these forces not. But at the end of the day, our country has at various times knowingly and at various times unknowingly made decisions that have made that problem worse. There was probably always going to be some disappearance of farms going on because we only have so much land and the industry was going to be competing and farmers were going to be buying each other. That's natural. What's not natural is all the things that we've done that have added to this problem, made it worse. And so, what farmers need is, yes, on the mental health front, we need more therapists, but more generally, what farms need is greater entrepreneurial opportunity,
Hmm.
new ways they can find a way to make money and help feed our country. That's something that can benefit consumers too, by the way. The more ways that farmers have to be able to make money and keep their family farms going, that means more options for food for consumers. And we need that right now because as we can see, food prices are through the roof, and our food supply was vulnerable during COVID and is often vulnerable during other crises. And so, finding a way to address this crisis of the disappearing American farmer can not only help those farmers, but it can help everyone in this country, especially those who care about where their food comes from. But even those who aren't thinking about it are paying higher prices right now. And it's not just because of the inflation that the two political parties are debating, it's also because of these underlying issues going on with the disappearing American farmer.
Now, those issues are the mental health you're speaking about, and then what other and what other aspects are we doing specifically, people that are not allowing for farmers to
Yeah.
grow?
Yeah, so there are economic, social, governmental, and technological things that have driven the disappearance of our farms. On an economic front, right now, most of us get our food from kind of the national and international global supply chains, right?
Yeah.
And those are things because they bring food from all over the world, and that's a good thing and it can provide more stability. But not as many of us these days, as opposed to decades ago, also get food from local and regional sources. And so that is one thing that
Hmm.
limits the amount of entrepreneur opportunity for farms. But more broadly, there were eras from the Depression to the 1980s farm crisis, all kinds of eras where the economic depression that would be hitting a particular part of the country was really bad for farmers and wiped farms out unnecessarily. We also have government policy that has at various times favored some types of farms over others. And
Hmm.
we also have technology, which technology in this country, at some point, it stopped working for farms of all sizes. There's something called scale neutral technology where it can work for large, medium, and small farms. We really stopped doing scale neutral technology in this country in a big enough way several decades ago. And it has meant that our smallest farms, even if they're efficient, even if they have the ability to make money, if they can only get a shot, they don't have the type of technology that they can afford. There's a technology that will help other farms, but not their farm. And so they aren't able to innovate at the same pace as larger farms, even if they are able to run as efficiently, which in some cases they could. So all of these things have kind of compounded upon top of one another to create this really big problem that took decades to solve, or took decades, excuse me, to create, and it may take many years to solve.
What's an example of a technology that maybe a smaller farm can't have, but a larger farm does? And when you're talking about larger farm, like, are you talking about a farm where they're, I don't like housing 36,000 chickens and like just pouring in food so that these chickens can get fat and then they can send them on to wherever they're supposed to go? Or like, how
Sure.
large, small farm are we comparing here?
Yeah, it really depends upon the industry. So a farm like I grew up on, dairy cows, at one time the midpoint for a dairy farm was 80 cows. We had 50, which meant we were kind of on the average to slightly smaller side. That
Okay.
mid is now 1,200 cows. So we went from being like a roughly medium-sized farm to minuscule.
Yeah.
And so it depends upon, that's kind of the scale we're talking about. And an example of technology, really, when you see the great big farm machinery that goes across a field where you can see they're covering like 20, 30 rows of field, or when you see the really big buildings where they can house, yeah, a ton of animals. Those are examples. And what happened is for a while in the 50s and 60s and 70s, the 1950s through the 1970s, we needed technology that could help farms get bigger because more and more people were leaving the farm to go work for factories because they could make more money in urban factories than they could on rural farms. And so we didn't have the workforce that we needed. And so we needed farms to be able to take on more acreage and more animals with fewer people breaking their backs to do it so that we could continue to feed this country without as much labor. So that was on some level, it was a good thing up to a certain point. But when we got into the late 1970s, by that time, farms had really caught up to a degree with factories as far as wages. It wasn't that out of balance anymore. So we didn't have to keep pursuing technology that only pushed us to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And I
Hmm.
want to be clear, some of these farms get bigger because they're supporting more than one family. A lot of these farms get bigger because they have to continue to compete. So that's a reality for those farms. But we didn't have to have technology that could only help those farms. We could have had continued to have technology that would allow large, medium, and small farms all innovate. And if we had done that, there might have been a way to keep more farms in this country, regardless of what size they were.
But couldn't smaller farms not afford the type of technology then?
That's a great question. That's where the term scale neutral comes in. So I'll give you an example of something with artificial intelligence, AI, that could be scale neutral in the future. So scale neutral means that farms of all sizes can afford it. And when a farmer like my dad is looking about whether to buy technology, he needs to say, okay, it's going to cost X amount and it's going to be, this much more efficient for me. So in 5 years or 10 years, it'll pay for itself. They call it penciling out. Does it pencil out? So scale neutral technology is, for example, AI is developing small driverless vehicles that can help spread, be it fertilizer or spraying fields, where big farms could have a bunch of them, small farms could have just a few of them, but they're like that individual unit is affordable. We could have AI go that way, or we could have AI go the direction of great big driverless tractors that only big farms can afford, and that you only need one worker to sit in front of kind of a big NASA bank of screens watching it, right? So you can see how technology could go either way.
Yeah.
And in the case of our technology through the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century, it really only went toward, not only there was technology that smaller farms can afford, but it became less and less common. And so we need more technology that you can have versions of it that work for large farms and then smaller versions of it that work for small farms. And it can be affordable, where it'll pay for itself over a short enough time horizon that a small farm can afford to make that investment.
It's so interesting. I guess maybe this is more of my pessimism coming in, but we as a culture don't seem to really value community, small community. And when we're talking about farmers, especially going back a couple decades, however long, I mean, we were talking about small communities that were actually helping each other support themselves. So each community had their farms, they had everything they needed, and they were kind of like a working unit as one thing. So they
Yeah.
needed each other. But now, I mean, because in part, as you said, we have so much technology, but also, I mean, nobody talks about farming. Public policy isn't about farming. We're talking about a lot of other things besides, that farming doesn't really come up. It's just not, I almost feel like you would need a cultural shift in order for people to care about the farmer. Because when I think farmer, just in modern day, I mean, honestly, I'm thinking he's almost like that black and white figure in the background, from those movies. Like it's just not something anymore. And even for when we go to the grocery store, right? Most of the time we're getting products that come from really big companies and they're not coming from some small farm. And if you do want to get something from a small farm, you have to go out of your way to find that farm. You maybe have to enter a co-op. And then depending on your state laws, there are certain things you can't buy that are just raw, which then limits you further. And then you have the problem of if I really want to buy, for instance, grass-fed beef from a local farm, whatever it is, it's going to be 10 times higher, which makes sense because they need the money than it is if I just go to Giant and buy beef from just a generic company. So, I mean, in that way, like, is that discouraging to you at all? I mean, how is it? It almost seems like there needs to be a cultural shift in attitude toward farmers, which I would feel like would be a much harder thing to accomplish than just like policy or something like that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are policy changes in terms of things that the government and private sector can do to encourage more innovation that can allow all farms to find new entrepreneur opportunities. There are policy changes around competition, around global trade, all kinds of things, right? But the bigger, deeper, more challenging thing, I think, is that cultural shift where we all begin to think about this more. And the thing that makes me feel optimistic about it, though, is that we're at a point in our country where we've undergone some changes that make more people, I think, more willing to have this conversation than ever before. So COVID was obviously a difficult time for many reasons, and there are very few good things that came out of it. One thing that did come out of it is that people saw the vulnerability of our food system.
Yeah.
They couldn't get the food they needed in the grocery store, and if they could, it was more expensive. And that was happening at the same time, by the way, that farmers couldn't find a place to sell their crops and products. There were animals being slaughtered and milk being dumped and produce being wasted. Why? Because the supply chain was locked up. And so we come out of COVID and people see that they care more than ever about where their food comes from. And they saw that our system has vulnerabilities. Food prices, again, have gone higher than the rate of inflation. Why? Because we have fewer farms and fewer links in that supply chain. So when you have fewer links in that supply chain from the farm gate to the dinner table, when one big distribution center goes down, or one big trucking line goes down, or one big food processor goes down, it can lock up a lot of food. And
Mm.
so COVID was the most extreme example, but it continues to happen and it will happen more and more. So whether there's an invasive pest, whether there's bird flu that's affecting the cost of chicken or eggs, whether there's some massive weather event, whether there's a crisis in a certain part of the globe, it is very easy for one big thing to disrupt a large amount of our food supply. So people care more where their food comes from than ever before, and people want to see their food become more affordable again. So if we were to only go to smaller farms and only go to that local food source where the beef costs a little more than you find in the store, yes, it would be more expensive. But we're not talking about swapping. Our big global and national supply chain is here to stay. But what if we had the ability to buy food from that large national global supply chain that can provide food from all over the country and can provide the quantity we need? And we had more farms in all parts of the country that were able to make a living by producing more different types of food for our consumers. We would have more choices. And so you might
Mm.
find beef expensive over here and apples cheaper over there, and people would be able to buy, and they should continue to buy some food from their traditional grocery stores. Maybe some of those grocery stores will begin to bring in more local and regional options. But then you also have the ability to shop at farmers markets that aren't just novelties on a Sunday morning, right? But they're actually a place that you, in a serious way, get your food from. permanent outdoor markets, specialty food stores, distributors of specialty foods. If we have this really robust food economy where more farms are able to find more entrepreneurial ways to make money and consumers are able to find more choices, then we have a whole lot of options as far as different foods at different prices. And we have a food system that's more diverse and has more channels to get food to us if
Yeah.
we do have a big disaster.
Well, do you think also in any way this has to do with, I mean, just kind of the human perspective on medical, on health? Because I know when I was speaking to Joel Saladin, he was telling me that, 50 years ago or whatever, people spent double on food than they would on medicine. And now it's switched. People spend more on medicine than they do on food because the medicine we have, you can maintain whatever diet you're on. And you just take this medicine to kind of negate the effects of the bad habits you have. It's not going to
Right.
fix it, but maybe you can live longer on those bad habits by taking this medicine.
Yeah.
Um, so and it's sad, but also in our cultural perspective, health has become a very big thing, but not necessarily in the right perspective of, oh, okay, I want to eat good food. I want to invest more money in eating good food. It's more of I want to eat whatever I want, but as long as I've got the medical doctors and I've got the medicine and the healthcare to take care of me, then I don't really need to invest in that, great food. I can get the coffee I want. I can get, the bad food I want, and I can just spend that, which honestly adds up. And then you're spending so much money on this bad food that you could spend on good food that would actually help you get sick less. I mean, does that contribute at all to this problem, you think?
Yeah, and he's absolutely right. When we were looking at this, we found that at one point, people spent about 40% of their income on food, and now it's like more like 10% or less. And so that's a modern miracle, right? That people don't
Yeah.
have to spend so much of their money on food. The challenge is that it's gone so far in the other direction where something like 70% of people are worried about additives in their food now because we have this food that is packaged and shipped all over and needs to be able to be served in all kinds of conditions, all parts of the globe. And the preservatives and the additives to make that possible, among other things, we just don't always know what's going in our food. And so more and more people than ever are worried about what's for dinner. And I do think there are underlying health issues that a lot of people in our population suffer from because we don't necessarily just have those fresh local options as an alternative as much as we would like. So it's one of those things that our food system today is a modern miracle, but there are also really deep flaws to it in terms of cost, in terms of reliability, and in terms of health. That if we don't get our arms around that, it can continue to go too far. We'll lose more farms, we'll lose our health, we lose so much. And we really lose a part of ourselves when we let a problem like this continue for too long.
Yeah, because it's so sad too. Because even I've had friends, myself, when we've gone overseas and have had food, it's so good. It's so fresh. It's from, because they don't have those problems that we have here. And friends that I've had that have like gluten-free allergies, they don't have them there. All these things where like even me, I have a lot of stomach issues going to another country like Israel or even England, like eating the food because it was fresh and it wasn't all this pasteurized. Like I didn't have any problems, but then I come back to America and all those problems return, which is just so unfortunate. And like you said, it's these farmers in a lot of ways that can provide some healthy alternatives to allow for people to have more choices, which can help in the long term with health.
Yep, absolutely. That's absolutely right. And we have a way that we can do this, and people are more interested in doing it than ever. There's also a reason for optimism because although we've lost on average 45,000 farms per year for a century, and that's led to the decline of 70% of our farms, we still have nearly 2 million farms left.
Mm.
And of those 2 million farms, 96% of them are family operations, 88% of them are small. People
Wow.
wonder how can those farms, yeah, people are a lot of times surprised by that. How can farms be surviving, right? Because we've just been talking about how hard it is. A lot of times what's going on is you have a farmer who's running the farm and is also working two or three other jobs. They might be pulling a factory shift, working a construction site, pouring
Wow.
cement in addition to operating a farm. Now imagine if we had these farms able to be growing entrepreneurial ventures again, where that farmer didn't have to work two, three jobs. They could just work the farm. That would allow these farms to grow and continue to survive and not just kind of stagger along, but actually thrive. It would give our consumers more options as far as food. fresh and local options, we could bring the cost of food down. We could improve innovation. We could improve our health. We could address so many of these issues if we just found a way to help those 2 million farms move forward in a more meaningful way.
Well, I mean, that's just so sad though, because that makes so much sense when you're talking about a mental health struggle. I mean, if you're working for jobs, nobody does well with that kind of pressure. Um, because I mean, your sleep is probably 2 hours, if that, which also affects your mental health that you don't sleep well. But I was gonna
Right.
ask you, family wise, how does this affect the family? Like we're talking about the farmer with the suicide rates, which is obviously tragic and hard. But how is like divorce rate among farming families or dysfunction among farming families? I mean, is there really are farm families going through a lot of hardship because of this too?
It's a great question. Families in farming communities, I think they experience the same problems and the same like rates of issues that any other family does. I don't think farm families are unique in that way. The thing that farm families are maybe a little unique or distinct about is that you're dealing with that economic hardship together. So rather than it being, dad's job or mom's job, it is the family's purpose. It's dad's job and mom's job. The kids are part of the chores as well. Whether or not the farm succeeds or fails is not just a matter of whether you keep your job or not, but whether or not you keep your home, whether you keep your community, and everybody feels that pressure, generational pressure, one after the other. There's a lot of pride in going one, two, three, four generations. My sister and I are fourth generation. There's a lot of pride in that. There's
Hmm.
also a lot of pressure that comes with that. Great grandpa made it through the early 1900s when it was subsistence farming. He dug his living out of the dirt. Grandpa grew up in the Great Depression and climbed in the middle class. Mom and dad survived the farm crisis. Why can't we? That's kind of like the way that each generation feels. And so, although I wouldn't say that farm families are different than any other family as it pertains to the types of challenges any family faces, farm families do deal with that economic hardship and the pride, but also the pressure that comes with that hardship, I think in a way that's a little bit distinct in this country.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that definitely sounds like it. Out of curiosity, are farming communities particularly religious or spiritual in any way? Because I'm thinking if they have such a hard work ethic, I mean, and they're working so hard, there may not really be that much time for spiritual connection. I mean, just practically not.
Yeah.
Um, so among farming communities, is there a particular interest or even just a space for that? Or is that just not something that's talked about much?
Yeah, it's a it's a part of the country in general where faith, I think, is really valued, and there does tend to be a little bit more tendency toward organized religion, and people in rural areas tend more so to go to church. But you're right that the pressure that farm families face means that it may be that there isn't room for their faith or their spirituality to necessarily have the impact that maybe it ought to. So I think that you wouldn't be surprised to go through a farm community and hear someone planning to go to church on Sunday, but whether it's having the impact that it should because they aren't able to focus on their spiritual well-being as well as their mental well-being, I think there's probably something to that. I grew up Catholic, and my family also went to a variety of different non-denominational churches, and so I grew up around faith. And I saw people who had a lot of strong faith, and I saw a lot of people for whom their faith had been broken by what was going on around them, or where, to your point, there really just wasn't room for it. So I think that, farm families struggle with that in the way that any family does, but there is an undercurrent of faith. And I think it's not the only place that it can come from, but there's a real resilience to farm families. When you go through what families like mine go through generation after generation, you
Yeah.
do build a strength and a resilience. And there's kind of a unique farmland spirit, and spirituality is maybe part of it, but it's that unique spirit that gives you the independence to dig your living out of the ground. And
Yeah.
also that sense of community come running when a neighbor is in trouble. And there are countless stories throughout the generations of not just economic hardship, but of neighbors running and helping each other out that really give me hope for farm families as well.
Yeah, because I can see how that resilience, I mean, that's precious because it's not something that's really valued now, especially because we are a very disconnected society. We have the technology, but we are very disconnected. We don't have great relationships. We don't have a great community structure. We don't have a really great community spirit. That's not just a thing. It's just not.
Yeah.
Um, but I would also think, and you mentioned this earlier, as you said, there's that pride also of having to continue on and be strong. But then you're going to have somebody along the generational line that maybe doesn't have that or just can't. And there's that, it's sad, I suppose, that there's so much pressure on it that there can't even be a breakaway in some ways or a way to continue the farming process without everyone having to do it. Um,
Yeah.
so I guess that resilience can be both good and bad, I suppose.
Yeah. My dad at the age of 8, the tender age of 8, stepped up and started doing the work of his father. And what happened is my grandpa was atop a corn crib in the middle of winter trying to replace a cap on top of the corn crib 30 feet up in the air. And he slipped off the roof and he fell 30 feet and hit the frozen ground, broke his back. He survived, but with a broken back, healing in the bedroom of their home, he had to have his son step up. So my dad, at the age of 8, started taking on the work of a man. And there were neighbors who came. You talk about community. There were neighbors who came and milked morning and night because in those days, milking is still heavy work, but in those days especially, it was heavy work that a boy of 8 couldn't have done on his own. But my dad did as much of the rest of the work as you could imagine, and he never really quit. When my grandpa was healed and was back up on his feet, well, the farm was growing and they needed to do more and they had to find more ways to make money because the economy was getting tougher. And, my dad never really stopped. He's 72 years old now. So he's been at that for 64 years.
Wow.
And, it's an amazing thing. It's something I'm really proud of. But when you have a family that grows up with that kind of pressure, it does take a toll on people as well over the years.
Hmm. Well, I want to ask you, Brian, just be respectful of your time, but what is it that kind of your common person can do about this? Because I'm sure people are listening and they're like, this is sad. Maybe I can try to get some food from a local farm nearby. Um, but is there anything practically people can do, and maybe even in an encouraging way to them, something that's more small scale, that it doesn't feel so big? Because, so many people aren't politicians or policymakers. So many people aren't even super rich that they can, just give money or do something. Like, what is something that your practical person can do because they care, but is not going to seem so overwhelming to them that they can't do it?
Yeah. As we looked at the hidden history of our family farms and looked at the different things that had driven this disappearance. And as I wove that with my family story, we saw a lot of places where there are kind of false choices and decisions that we made that we didn't have to. And we saw that one thing would have really helped, and I think it's something that can help in the future, which is if people just ask themselves the question, what am I doing to create new opportunity for our farms? What am I doing to
Hmm.
create new opportunities for our farmers? And that's different than do I support the farmers? And because if you support the farmers, you might every now and then go to a farmer's market and pick something up and you feel good about that for the day, but it's not really a serious way that you get your food, right?
Yeah.
Or if you talk to someone running for office, next time they knock on your door or they're in a parade or speaking at a local Rotary Club or what have you, if you ask a politician on either side of the aisle if they support the farmers, they say, oh, I support the farmers. And they got some sort of vote or some sort of vote they would take that, supports some sort of program for the farms. If instead we're asking ourselves and we're asking our leaders, what are you doing to create new opportunity for farms? That changes things. So now I'm not saying that for the consumer, you have to go 20 different places to get your groceries, but you might start to think, okay, well, what food do I need to buy at the grocery store? And what food do they have there that is from local sources? And then what food can I get at a farmer's market on a regular basis that's a portion of my groceries? When can I stop at a local butcher shop to purchase meat that was, from a local farm and is, by
Hmm.
the way, being by a local small business? What other types of specialty food stores do I have? Is there a CSA that I could join? Is there a co-op that I could get food from? So I'm not saying you got to have 20 sources for your food, but maybe you have two or three instead of just one. And if everybody made that small shift, that could really open up and make a much bigger, more robust market for farms all across the country. In the same way, if we ask that same question of our political leaders, what are you doing to create new opportunities for our farms? That will force them to give you truly new ideas. Well, here's what I'm doing to create innovation. Here's what I'm doing to create a government policy that is a barrier for our farms. Instead of just telling you they support farms and the lip service, they have to actually think about it. And if their answer doesn't give you something that shows you more ways the farms can make money and more ways that you can have more choices as a consumer, that political leader hasn't thought about this issue long enough. So that key question, I think, can really help all of us with our own behavior and with
Mm,
what we expect of leaders.
wow. I gotta be honest. It's been a long time since I've had a political leader that I could put that much faith in.
Yeah.
um, but Brian, thank you so much. I learned a ton. I mean, as you could see, I was trying to understand, and it's such an encouragement to me that, first of all, that you have optimism about it, because I think that helps other people think that there's a way to do something about this. But also it's just encouraging because I think it's just true and good, if you know what I mean. And I think it's worth something for people to fight for and to think about and to research more. So I really appreciate your time. And again, for listeners, I'm going to have his website posted along with the podcast. Please check it out because it has information on the book. It has information on him, work he's done. Um, and Brian, if people have questions, can they reach out to you personally, or do you have like maybe a
Yeah.
secretary they can talk to?
No, absolutely. So on my website, there's a spot where you can reach out and email me, and I'm happy to connect and happy to see how I can help or what kind of conversation we can have. The other things people will find in there, as you said, more information in the book, more information on me and my family and our farm. They'll find ways that they can purchase the book. It's available on Amazon. Land Rich Cash Poor is available on Amazon and other online retailers. Also at local bookstores all across the country. They'll either have it or they can order it for you. And I guess I just hope that people who hear this conversation have an opportunity to think about how can we do something about these issues. And I think it's something that can not only benefit farm families to stop that hollowing out of rural America, but it can benefit all families in this country because it is the food that we eat. And no farms, no food is really a truthful refrain. And I think it's something we can all work together on. So I
I
appreciate you taking the time
agree.
on the issue.
Well, thank you, Brian. Thank you so much for writing this book and also for being vulnerable with your family struggles.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Have a good day.
All right, you too.